David Henderson was 38 years old, and for the last decade of his life, his salary as a public high school history teacher had hovered around a respectable, if entirely unremarkable, $52,000 a year. He stood near a grand stone fireplace, the polished oak mantelpiece cool against his elbow, and watched his ex-wife Monique glide across the crowded terrace. She was a vision in a cream-colored silk dress that probably cost more than his first car. And it was at that precise moment, under the warm glow of fairy lights strung through the ancient oaks of the lakeside estate, that she decided to complete his humiliation. She approached him, a flute of champagne, $150 a bottle, he knew for a fact, held delicately in her perfectly manicured fingers, her new fiancé, a real estate developer named Julian, trailing in her wake like a well-heeled shadow. "David," she said, her voice a little too loud, drawing the attention of his cousins nearby. "I see you're still getting some use out of that old suit. What is that charcoal?" "It was dated when you bought it for my cousin's wedding 10 years ago. It's practically a historical artifact now. How fitting for a history teacher." Her laughter was light and tinkling, but it carried the sharp, cruel edge of a shard of glass. Julian smirked, adjusting the cuffs of his own bespoke linen jacket, a cool $4,200, David guessed. David looked down at his suit. It was simple, clean, and perfectly pressed. It was also the only one he owned. He had bought it for $600 at a department store sale, a significant expense at the time, and had worn it to every wedding, funeral, and formal event since. He felt the familiar, hot flush of shame creep up his neck, the shame she had become so expert at cultivating. He simply nodded, a quiet acknowledgement of her jab. What Monique didn't know, what no one in their glittering orbit knew, was that the simple, unassuming man in the 10-year-old suit had paid for every single thing she was currently enjoying. The champagne flute in her hand, the silk dress on her back, the very ground beneath her designer heels. To understand how a man could be so thoroughly underestimated, you had to go back 2 years to a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. David and Monique had lived in a modest 3-bedroom ranch house in a quiet, middle-class suburb. It was the house David had inherited from his parents, a place of warm memories and slightly worn-out charm. For David, it was home. For Monique, it was a prison of mediocrity. Their life together had been a constant negotiation between his contentment and her ambition. He found joy in simple things. Grading papers at the kitchen table while she cooked, the smell of freshly cut grass on a Saturday morning, the comfortable silence they once shared watching old movies. Monique's joy, however, was transactional. It was measured in carats, square footage, and the envy of her friends. "Look at this kitchen," she'd say, running a dismissive hand over the laminate countertops he and his father had installed 20 years prior. "It's so brown." Brenda just got her kitchen redone. Italian marble, a wolf range, $12,000. A Sub-Zero refrigerator, $14,500. "It looks like a magazine, David. We look like a thrift store." He had tried to explain. "Monique, I'm a teacher. We have a good life. We're comfortable. We don't have Italian marble debt either." "Comfortable is just another word for stagnant?" she'd retort, her eyes sweeping over their cozy living room with profound disappointment. She saw not the life they had built, but everything it wasn't. She saw his scuffed leather armchair, not the Roche-Beaubois sectional her sister owned. She saw his collection of history books, not a curated wall of abstract art. She saw his reliable 10-year-old sedan, not the new Mercedes SUV Julian would eventually buy her. The pressure was relentless, a slow, grinding erosion of his sense of self. He started taking on extra work, tutoring on weekends, teaching summer school, all to fund the escalating costs of her happiness. There was the spa weekend with her friends, $2,500. The designer handbag she absolutely had to have for a charity gala, $3,800. The constant wardrobe updates driven by her Instagram feed. He was running on a treadmill, and she kept increasing the speed. The true betrayal, however, was never just about the money. It was about respect. It withered slowly, then all at once. It started with small comments in front of friends. Oh, David wouldn't know about that. His idea of fine dining is a place with cloth napkins. It grew into open contempt. He'd come home, exhausted from a 12-hour day of teaching and coaching the debate team, to find her dressed for a night out, smelling of expensive perfume, $320 for a small bottle of Baccarat Rouge 540. Don't wait up, she'd say, not even looking at him as she checked her reflection in the hall mirror. I'm meeting Brenda for drinks. He later learned through a carelessly left open credit card statement that Brenda was often a 5-star hotel restaurant, and drinks was a $600 dinner for two. The other person was never named, but the pattern was undeniable. He saw charges from a high-end men's clothing store, a purchase for a bottle of scotch he knew she would never drink, 2 tickets to a jazz club on a night she claimed to be at a yoga retreat. The discovery that finally broke him was not a document, but a sound. It was a Tuesday night. He was in his small home office, a converted spare bedroom where he was quietly building something he rarely spoke of. For years, in the quiet hours after she went to bed, David had been pouring his passion for history into a different medium. He was developing an interactive historical curriculum software, a dynamic platform that brought dusty textbook chapters to life, with virtual tours, primary source documents, and gamified learning modules. It was his secret passion project, a creative outlet he believed could one day revolutionize how kids learn. He never told Monique the full scope of it. He'd tried once, early on, and she dismissed it with a wave of her hand. That sounds nice, honey, like a little hobby. She couldn't see the value in anything that didn't have a designer logo on it. That night he overheard her in the living room, talking on the phone to her sister, her voice low, but carrying clearly down the hall. I just can't do it anymore, Sharon, Monique whispered, her voice thick with a theatrical despair. I feel like I'm suffocating in this house, in this life. He's a good man, I guess, but he's so small. His ambition fits inside his little Toyota. Julian. Julian sees the world the way I do. He wants to own it, not just rent a little piece of it. There was a pause. David sat frozen in his chair, the glow of his monitor illuminating the sudden, stark emptiness in his chest. No, I haven't told him yet, Monique continued. The timing has to be right. Julian's deal on the waterfront property is closing next month. Once that's secure, I can finally leave. I just have to play the part of the supportive wife for a few more weeks. God, it's exhausting. Pretending to be interested in his little computer game or whatever it is he tinkers with in there, it's pathetic. Not anger, not sadness, not even betrayal. The first thing David felt was a profound and chilling clarity. It was as if he'd been looking at a blurry photograph for years, and in that instant, it snapped into sharp, brutal focus. The woman he had loved, the life he had tried so hard to build and preserve, was a performance, a lie, and he was the last one to know the show was ending. He didn't storm out of his office. He didn't confront her. He simply closed the laptop, the screen going dark on the project she just called pathetic. He sat in the silence for a long time, listening to the muffled sounds of his wife planning her escape. He heard her hang up the phone, the soft click of her heels on the hardwood floor as she went to the bedroom. He heard the water run in the master bathroom, the quiet hum of her electric toothbrush, the mundane domestic sounds of a life that was already a ghost. In that quiet, dark room, the David who made excuses, the David who absorbed insults, the David who tried to buy love with weekend tutoring money quietly died. A new David was born, one who was patient analytical, and saw the world not with his heart, but with the cold, clear eyes of a historian examining a primary source document. And the document of his marriage told a very clear story of deception and exploitation. The next morning, he called in sick to work for the first time in 15 years. He didn't stay home. He drove to the city and walked into the lobby of a downtown law firm, the kind with glass walls, expensive art, and hushed, carpeted hallways. He had found the firm online, specializing in high-asset divorce and corporate law. He had no appointment. He walked up to the mahogany reception desk and asked to see the firm's senior partner, a man named Marcus Thorne. The receptionist, a coolly professional woman in her 50s, looked at his simple teacher's attire, khakis and a polo shirt, and then back at her screen. "Mr. Thorne's schedule is booked for the next 6 months," she said, her tone a polite dismissal. David didn't flinch. "Please tell him that David Henderson is here to discuss the intellectual property valuation and sale of EduTech Dynamics, and also a pending marital dissolution." The name EduTech Dynamics was the name of his little hobby, the shell company he'd set up years ago. It meant nothing to her, but he was counting on it meaning something to a man like Thorne, whose firm had a major tech law division. He sat in the lobby for 45 minutes, calmly reading a financial magazine, ignoring the curious glances from paralegals rushing by. Finally, a door opened, and a tall, impeccably dressed black man in his late 50s emerged. Marcus Thorne was everything David was not: sharp, commanding, and radiating an aura of quiet, expensive power. He looked at David, then at the note from his receptionist. "Mr. Henderson," Thorne said, his voice a low baritone, "you have my attention for 5 minutes. Walk with me." David followed him into a corner office with a panoramic view of the city. He laid out his story with the detached precision of a historian presenting a thesis. He spoke of Monique's spending, her contempt, and the overheard phone call. He didn't speak with emotion, but with facts, dates, and figures. Then he opened his old leather briefcase and took out his laptop. He opened the software he had built. For 20 minutes, he walked Marcus Thorne through his creation. He showed him the interactive maps of ancient Rome, the 3D models of feudal castles, the algorithm that adapted quizzes to a student's learning style. He showed him the beta testing results from a dozen schools across the country who were using it for free, and the glowing testimonials from their teachers. When he was finished, Thorne was silent for a full minute, looking at the screen, then at David. "Mr. Henderson," he said slowly, "this isn't a hobby. This is a multi-million-dollar asset. Have you had it valued?" "No," David said. "I've been too busy building it. And frankly, I never thought in those terms. I just wanted to make history more engaging for my students." "Well, it's time you started," Thorne replied, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Because from what I can see, you're about to become a very wealthy man, and your wife's timing for wanting a divorce could not possibly be worse for her or better for you." That was the beginning of David's strategic transformation. Over the next 3 months, his life became a carefully managed secret. To Monique, he was the same pliable, slightly pathetic husband. He went to work, graded papers, and absorbed her increasingly frequent barbs and absences with a quiet resignation she mistook for weakness. He played his part perfectly. Meanwhile, his real life was happening in encrypted emails and discreet meetings in Marcus Thorne's conference room. Thorne's firm brought in a team of intellectual property experts and venture capital analysts. They valued his software, EduTech Dynamics, at a conservative estimate of $40 million. Within 6 weeks, they had a serious offer on the table from one of the largest educational technology companies in the world. While the acquisition was being negotiated in secret, Thorne's family law division was preparing for the divorce. "The key," Thorne had explained, leaning back in his leather chair, $9,000, "is to let her make the first move, Let her file. Let her lay out her demands. She's operating from a position of profound ignorance about your actual financial state. We, on the other hand, will be operating from a position of total knowledge. It's a strategic advantage you can't put a price on. David also learned something else during that time. A letter arrived from an estate lawyer in another state. His great-aunt Ilara, his grandmother's reclusive sister, whom he had only met a handful of times as a child, had passed away. She had lived a frugal, solitary life, and the family had always assumed she had very little. They were wrong. She had quietly invested her small inheritance decades ago and had never touched it. The portfolio was now worth just over $3 million. And because David was the only relative who had bothered to send her a Christmas card and a handwritten letter every single year, she had left the entire estate to him. He received the news on a Thursday. He read the letter in his car in the school parking lot and felt a wave of dizziness. He called Thorne. "Well," the lawyer said, a note of dark amusement in his voice. "The universe appears to be on your side, Mr. Henderson. We'll place the inheritance into a blind trust immediately. As it was bequeathed solely to you after your unofficial separation, and given your wife's demonstrable behavior, we can argue successfully that it is non-marital property. She won't see a dime of it." 2 weeks later, just as Thorne had predicted, Monique made her move. David came home to find her sitting at the kitchen table, her posture rigid. The air was thick with manufactured gravity. "David, we need to talk," she began. He sat down, feigning a weary surprise. He listened as she delivered a well-rehearsed speech about growing apart, about needing to find herself, about how she would always care for him but wasn't in love with him anymore. It was a masterclass in compassionate cruelty, designed to make her the victim of a loveless marriage, rather than the architect of its destruction. She slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a list of her demands, drawn up by her own, far less competent lawyer. She wanted the house, half of his teacher's pension, and alimony for 5 years. It was a list made by a woman who believed her husband's entire net worth was tied up in a modest suburban home and a public school retirement fund. David looked at the paper. He looked at her. He felt a profound sense of pity for her. Her greed was so large, but her vision was so small. "If this is what you want, Monique," he said, his voice quiet and steady, "then I won't fight you." The look of relief on her face was staggering. She had expected a fight, tears, begging. His immediate capitulation confirmed her narrative. He was weak, a man who would simply fold. The divorce was swift and, on her side, painless. She got the house. She got a cash settlement for her share of his pension. He signed the papers without argument. He packed his belongings into a dozen cardboard boxes and moved into a small, furnished apartment across town. He sold his old Toyota and bought a simple, reliable used Honda. To Monique and everyone in her circle, David Henderson had been wiped out. A man left with nothing but his threadbare suits and his dusty books. The sale of Editech Dynamics closed the day after the divorce was finalized. The final acquisition price was $47 million. The money, along with his inheritance, was wired into a series of trusts and investment accounts managed by Thorne's firm. On paper, David Henderson, the history teacher, still had a modest checking account. In reality, he was one of the wealthiest men in the state. He didn't change his life. He kept his apartment. He continued to teach for the rest of the school year, finding comfort in the routine and the genuine connection with his students. He didn't buy a new car or a new wardrobe. He lived quietly, letting the world believe Monique's version of the story. He knew that true power wasn't in flaunting wealth, but in controlling the narrative. And the final chapter of their story had yet to be written. The invitation for the Henderson family reunion arrived 6 months later. It was a grand affair held every 2 years, a tradition started by his great-grandfather. This year, it was being hosted by his Uncle Robert, his father's older brother, and the family's undisputed patriarch. Uncle Robert was a self-made man who had built a construction empire from the ground up. He was wise, kind, and had a knack for seeing through nonsense. He had always been fond of David, but he'd been politely distant with Monique, sensing her brittle ambition. David knew Monique would be there. She still considered herself part of the family's social fabric, and she wouldn't miss an opportunity to showcase her upgrade. She would be there with Julian, her new fiancé, a walking advertisement for her successful escape from mediocrity. A week before the reunion, David drove 2 hours to his uncle's office. He sat with Robert in his large, comfortable office, overlooking a bustling construction site. He told his uncle everything, the whole story, the software, the inheritance, the divorce, Monique's deception. He laid it all out, not with bitterness, but with the calm finality of a historical account. When he was done, Uncle Robert was quiet for a long time, his gaze fixed on his nephew. "I never liked her," he said finally, his voice rumbling with conviction. "I saw the way she looked at you. Like you were a starter home she was planning to flip. What do you want to do, son?" "I don't want revenge, Uncle Robert," David said, and he meant it. "Revenge is a hot, messy emotion. I want accountability. I want a reckoning based on truth. I want her to see what she threw away. Not because of the money, but because of who she is. She judges the world based on price tags. I want her to finally see the receipt." A slow, knowing smile spread across his uncle's face. "I think," he said, leaning forward, "I know just how to deliver the bill." And so David arrived at the reunion in his old Honda, wearing his 10-year-old suit. He watched as Monique and Julian pulled up in a brand-new black Range Rover, $120,000. He watched her greet family members with air kisses, her 3-carat diamond engagement ring catching the light. He saw the looks of pity his cousins gave him, the whispers that followed him as he got a drink from the bar. He endured it all with a placid calm that they mistook for defeat, which brought him back to the fireplace, the scent of wood smoke and expensive perfume in the air, with Monique's cruel laughter echoing in his ears. "A historical artifact," she repeated, savoring the line. "You should donate it to one of your little museums, David." Before he could respond, a warm, heavy hand landed on his shoulder. It was Uncle Robert. He was holding a microphone. "Excuse me, everyone." Robert's voice boomed through the speakers set up around the sprawling lawn. "If I could have your attention for a moment." A hush fell over the crowd. Monique gave David one last, dismissive smirk and turned her attention to the stage, expecting a typical welcome speech. "Welcome, Henderson family," Robert began, his voice full of warmth. "It does my heart good to see all of us together at this beautiful place. We have family here from 15 different states. We have 4 generations present today. From my dear Aunt Clara, who is 94 years young, to little Maya, who is just 6 months old. This is what it's all about." He paused, letting the sentiment settle. Now, I know a lot of you have been asking me about this spectacular venue, the wonderful food from one of the best caterers in the state, the open bar, the live band we have coming on later. It's a bit grander than our usual reunions, I admit, and I've been letting everyone think it was my treat. But tonight, I have to be honest and give credit where credit is due. He turned and looked directly at David. A flicker of confusion crossed Monique's face. "This entire event," Uncle Robert declared, his voice ringing with pride. "The venue rental, $25,000 for the weekend. The catering for 200 people, $48,000. The top-shelf liquor and champagne you're all enjoying, $15,000. The jazz trio, $7,500. Every single penny was paid for by one person, a person who asked for no recognition, who wanted to give this gift to the family anonymously. But I believe that true generosity, especially when it comes from such a humble and good heart, deserves to be acknowledged. He paused for dramatic effect. The crowd was silent, hanging on his every word. Monique was looking around, a tight, expectant smile on her face, perhaps thinking it was Julian who had made some grand, secret gesture. "The person who paid for everything we are enjoying tonight," Uncle Robert said, his voice dropping slightly, "is my nephew David Henderson." The silence that followed was not just an absence of sound. It was a physical presence, a heavy, weighted blanket of pure shock that smothered the entire party. Every head swiveled in perfect unison to stare at David, the quiet history teacher, in the 10-year-old suit. His cousins' pitying looks curdled into disbelief. His aunts' and uncles' polite smiles froze on their faces. Monique's reaction was the most profound. Her perfectly constructed mask of serene superiority shattered into a million pieces. The color drained from her face, leaving her foundation looking like a pale, chalky layer of dust. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. She looked from Uncle Robert to David, and back again, her mind visibly failing to process the information. It was a cognitive dissonance so extreme, it was almost comical. The man she had just mocked as a pathetic relic was being revealed as the secret benefactor of this entire, lavish affair. Julian, her fiancé, looked equally stunned. He glanced at Monique, then at David, a new, calculating expression in his eyes. He was a man who understood money, and he was quickly recalibrating his assessment of the man standing before him. Uncle Robert wasn't finished. "But that's not all," he continued, his voice regaining its booming strength. "David's generosity goes much deeper than just one spectacular party. 6 months ago, he established the Henderson Family Educational Trust, a foundation with an initial endowment of $5 million. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. $5 million. The number was so absurd, so disconnected from the man they thought they knew, that it sounded like a mistake. "This trust," Robert explained, "will provide a full college scholarship every single year in perpetuity to any child in the Henderson family who gets accepted into a 4-year university. It will cover tuition, room, board, and books. It ensures that no child in this family will ever have to compromise on their dreams because of money. That is a legacy that will last for generations." He walked over to David and clapped him on the back again, a gesture of profound affection and respect. "Your father would be so proud of you, son. So damn proud." Tears welled in the eyes of David's Aunt Carol, whose son was a high school senior, stressing about student loans. His cousin Marcus, who had 2 young daughters, looked at David with an expression of pure, unadulterated gratitude. The entire social fabric of the family was reweaving itself in real time, with David Henderson, the quiet, overlooked teacher, now firmly at its center. But the final blow, the one aimed with surgical precision at the heart of Monique's materialistic worldview, was yet to come. "Some of you may know," Uncle Robert said, his tone shifting to something more serious, "that our family matriarch, my dear Aunt Clara, was in danger of losing her home of 60 years. The reverse mortgage she took out a decade ago was coming due, and the bank was threatening foreclosure." He looked over at the 94-year-old woman, who was watching him with rapt attention from her wheelchair. 2 months ago, an anonymous benefactor contacted the bank and paid off the entire mortgage, all $187,000 of it. The deed is now free and clear, and Aunt Clara will be able to live out her days in the home she loves, with peace and security. He paused, then looked directly at Monique, his eyes hard as stone. That benefactor was also David. If the first two revelations had been shocks, this one was an execution. It wasn't just about wealth. It was about character. It was about kindness, family, and legacy. All the things Monique had traded for a bigger diamond and a faster car. The silence was finally broken by Aunt Clara, who let out a sob, her frail hand covering her mouth. "Oh, David," she whispered, her voice cracking. "My dear boy." That was the signal. The dam of politeness broke. The family surged forward, not in a rush, but in a slow, steady wave of affection. They surrounded David, hugging him, clapping his back, their faces shining with a mixture of awe and love. They didn't see a millionaire. They saw the good-hearted boy they had always known, now revealed to have a strength they had never suspected. Monique stood frozen on the edge of the crowd, utterly alone. Julian had taken a small but significant step away from her. He was watching the scene with a cold, appraising look. He had attached himself to what he thought was a winner, a beautiful woman with expensive taste, who had cleverly shed her mediocre past. Now he was realizing she had made the worst trade of her life. She hadn't just divorced a man, she'd divorced a fortune and, more importantly, a legacy. Her judgment was flawed, and in his world, flawed judgment was a fatal liability. David finally met Monique's eyes across the sea of smiling relatives. He saw no triumph in her devastation. He just saw a hollow woman, stripped bare of her pretenses. The designer dress, the perfect hair, the glittering ring, it all looked like a cheap costume now. He had not laid a hand on her, had not raised his voice. He had simply allowed the truth to be told. Her own value system, the one that prized external validation above all else, had become the weapon of her own undoing. The silence from the crowd was her judgment. The admiration for him was her sentence. She turned, her movements stiff and robotic, and walked away from the party, Julian trailing several feet behind her, his phone already in his hand, likely calling his driver. She didn't look back. There was nothing left for her here. She had mocked his old suit, a symbol of his supposed poverty, only to discover it was the uniform of a quiet king who owned the entire castle. Later that evening, as the jazz band played a soft melody under the stars, David sat by the lake with his Uncle Robert. They watched the moonlight dance on the water, a comfortable silence between them. "You know," Robert said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, "revenge is a fool's game. But letting a person's own character deliver their consequences, that's justice, and it is deeply, deeply satisfying to watch." David nodded. He didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel vindicated. He felt free. The weight of Monique's judgment, a burden he had carried for years, had vanished. It had been replaced by the warmth of his family's genuine respect and the quiet satisfaction of his own purpose. He had spent the last 6 months after the sale of his company not on himself but on solidifying his foundations. He'd set up the trusts, secured his family's future, and made sure the people who mattered were cared for. The money hadn't changed him. It had simply amplified who he had always been, a quiet, thoughtful man who cared about history, family, and building things that last. In the months that followed, the ripples of that night spread. Monique and Julian's engagement was quietly called off a few weeks later. Her social circle, which worshipped success above all, began to distance themselves from a woman who had made such a monumental error in judgment. She was forced to sell the house, his parents' house, to cover her extravagant debts, and moved into a small, generic condo. Her life, once a carefully curated performance of upward mobility, became a quiet lesson in social gravity. David, on the other hand, flourished. He finished the school year, giving his students a farewell speech about the importance of pursuing their passions, no matter how small or insignificant they might seem to others. He then poured his energy and resources into a new venture, the Henderson Foundation for Historical Preservation. He traveled the country, funding the digitization of fragile historical archives, restoring neglected historical landmarks, and creating educational programs for underserved schools. He didn't live a flashy life. He bought a comfortable but modest home on a few acres of land outside the city. He still drove a sensible car. He found that his greatest luxury was not owning expensive things but owning his own time. He could spend an entire afternoon reading, a whole week tracing historical routes, a whole month overseeing a restoration project without having to answer to anyone. He learned that true wealth wasn't a number in a bank account. It was the freedom to live authentically. It was the ability to be generous without needing applause. It was the quiet confidence that came from knowing your own worth, independent of the suit you were wearing or the car you were driving. Sometimes he would think of Monique and that night at the reunion. He felt no anger, only a distant clinical pity. She had been so busy chasing the glittering reflection of a successful life that she had failed to see the real, solid gold standing right in front of her. She had mistaken his patience for weakness, his kindness for naivete, and his contentment for a lack of ambition. It was the most expensive mistake of her life, but the bill was one she would have to pay herself. David understood something fundamental about the world that she never would. Character is the only currency that never loses its value. And as he stood on the steps of a newly restored 19th century library his foundation had saved, watching a group of excited schoolchildren rush inside, he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that he was the richest man in the world. His suit was still in his closet, a quiet reminder not of humiliation, but of the day he finally showed everyone what it meant to be truly well-dressed, clothed in integrity, purpose, and a quiet, unshakable strength.